Hello, everybody, and welcome to Karma Insights. I'm your host, Krishan Patel, and we are going to continue our thread about digital transformations in multiple different sectors, specifically higher education. I'm joined by my guest, Jessica Otunuya, and Jess is a director with Karma Advisory, and we wanted to take this time to give everyone an overview of the higher education space and some of the challenges that we see in higher ed, but that we also see across a multitude of other industries. So first, I wanted to start off, and everyone, here's how we're going to do this. We're going to ask a couple of questions and throw those questions out, and then we're both going to answer them and jump into them so everyone can get an overview of the different areas. So Jess, first of all, can you give an overview of the higher education space? If someone is trying to understand all of the core components that one would think about, what would they be?
There's so many components, but I'm going to start with giving an example of an institution size. And then from there, I'm going to go into kind of how the data can exist. So imagine you have an institution that's about 20,000 students in size, that's split between undergraduate and graduate populations. And within that institution, there are also 4 schools or colleges, for lack of a better word. Within each college, there are specialties, right? So perhaps your business school, your college of education, maybe your college of arts and sciences, and a 4th college that we'll call something else for right now. And within that institution and those 4 colleges or schools, each of those schools operate within their own governing structure. They're able to, and they do manage their own admissions processes. They manage their own data. And there's very little centralization between the 4 schools, particularly when it comes to the undergrad populations. For graduate schools, there definitely is even more difference and nuance because of the uniqueness of each graduate population. So that's the overall structure that adds to complexity. Once we think about that structure, we then think about how the data flows. So I mentioned that admissions is managed independently and individually by each college, which means that something as simple as the name that is used by a prospective student or an applicant could vary between applications at 4 different colleges. And so there needs to be some way to identify that information, to potentially merge that information, or this person could end up having duplicate records across 4 different colleges. Maybe that doesn't matter in undergrad because they select one college, but then they decide to pursue a graduate program at that same institution. And now they have another duplicate record with no ability to necessarily ensure that the data has integrity and that the data shares the information that it should share.
Now, what I also want to go into is if I were to, what I want to share with everyone today is if we were to say, what is a student life cycle? And that way we can give everyone a flow of, all right, here's a student coming into a higher education system, and here's a student leaving the higher education system. And so everyone can understand the different, more from the student experience. And the way that we like to look at this at Karma Advisory is we like to look at everything from creating an experience life cycle so we can understand the overall areas that are relevant to the end user or student or customer in this instance. So, looking at, why don't we start off at admissions and enrollment, and then why don't you take us around that experience life cycle?
For sure. So you're absolutely right. For that, the student life cycle, we would actually begin as a prospective student, right? Someone who's expressing interest. And so that student shows up their kind of initial touch point or data entry with the institution is an expression of interest, followed by an application, followed by application review and some mechanism for that to kind of be reviewed. From there, there's like a, kind of go, no go point where that prospective student either transfers into being an enrolled student or declines, right? Once the student is enrolled, the primary pathway would then be that the student is typically starting at the point of the registrar and financial aid, right? So those are 2 typically different systems, but clearly are very much related because financial aid ties directly to enrollment information. Enrollment information is managed by the registrar. And then From that registrar, and typically that is kind of managed ideally centrally, but in the instance, the example that I gave, right, it could also be something that is very unique to each college within this overall larger institution. So the other ways that the student's data flows are that student, of course, is primarily in school for the academic focus slash the registrar, right? That's where the grades are housed, school year level, GPA, major concentration, minor. So all of those things typically tied to your course of study as an enrolled student. But that student is not just experiencing school in that silo, just as an academic. As we know, the goal of higher ed is to also create well-rounded individuals. And so there's also other things the student could experience. So that might be athletics, that might be student health services, right? Whether they be medical services or even mental health related services. That student could also be involved in co-curricular things, student clubs, activities, on-campus events that are just geared towards certain school year levels, or maybe a specific profile for that student. Maybe there's a undergraduate business major specific event, and that's what the student is partaking in. They also could be and should be partaking in academic counseling or advising with their academic advisor from their college. They also could be pursuing career services and seeking coaching or counseling through that forum. They also could be staying on campus, right? So even like their dormitory and like that student life, if they're living in a residence on campus, that's another data point that is kind of following them, and data is necessary for that point. And then outside of that kind of overall way that the student's data could flow if they're actively enrolled, that student eventually, hopefully, graduates from the institution, and then they convert to an alumni status. And as an alumni, they have some access to the same resources, but likely not the same depth of resources that you receive when you're paying student activity fees and you're actively enrolled. And then that graduate now as an alumni has the ability to pursue additional coursework at the college. So then we repeat that student life cycle over, because that graduate alumni could then turn back into a prospective enrollee to pursue an additional degree program, which adds complexity because you want to ensure that the experience of that person does not feel like all of their prior records at that exact institution, or maybe even the same college or school in this case, is erased, right? There's some amount of data that they would expect or hope to be retained so that the quality of their experience is not having to start from scratch.
Thank you so much, Jess. That is such a helpful overview. And I think that, there's two things that I want to bring up here. I think the next overall question, and I think it becomes very obvious, is when you look at this overview of higher education, is like, what are the key complicating factors that make this difficult? And I think in some ways, you just sharing the baseline shares what those complicating factors are. One is there is clearly some amount of data that is centralized on a student, and then you have all of these other spokes to this wheel that have to do with additional data regarding the student. And then there's a cyclical aspect to this as well in the case of them seeking additional degrees. And so the thing that starts to occur very easily here is that one is you have no source of truth. Fundamentally, there are just duplicate records in so many different ways, in so many different places. Two is you have potentially different definitions of data amongst all of these areas, whether it is in academic advising or co-curricular activities, right? Or even the financial aid, right, areas. So you have different definitions of data. And then I think it's just generally this idea that you're going to have a lot of different silos here. These are not, it's not like all these teams are co-located and working cross-functional teams and anything like that. They're doing financial aid. That's a very specific role and function, and they have different systems that are required there, and different roles and responsibilities, and different organizational structures, different compliance considerations that they need to think about. And the same thing goes across all of these different areas. And I think that at the end of the day, one could look at this and say, all right, well, what would be potential solutions to reduce this complexity? And Jess, I'll throw that out to you first to kind of mention some of the things that from your perspective. And then I'll also share, generally with higher education, but also generally speaking, when we look at, data governance and digital transformations, how folks should really look at this. And we're not just talking about this from a technology perspective. We're talking about this from a business perspective on the honest realities of what it means to start the long journey of fixing this issue. Because I think the big thing that I want to share that I think is really important on this topic is if you don't have an actual understanding of uh, a student and then all of the data around the student, you can never really make educated decisions because you can't create a report off of messy data. It's just not possible. And so you can only clean up components of data, but you never get a full 360 degree picture. So I'll pause there. But Jess, what do you view as some of the solutions or some of the things that you have seen that make this function a little bit better?
For sure. I would say, I think based on my observations and just kind of like the benchmarking across institutions, is I don't think that there's a singular institution that's like knocking it out of the park, but I do think that there are some commonalities for what has been acknowledged. And I think a major point that you said though, Christian, is like when we replace the word student with customer, right? Automatically these kind of solutions become semi-transferable because part of one of the other complicating factors that I didn't explicitly state though is a matter of risk and a low quality customer experience, which is what ultimately an institution wants to mitigate, right? Enrollment is one of the key factors that drives income and revenue for an institution, and so lacking that is also problematic, right? So I think knowing that, I think there are a few solutions or kind of analyses that I think, depending on the institution size. In this case, I'll speak to this example institution that we created that's 20,000 students, split undergraduate, graduate, 4 colleges. But any institution of its sort could likely apply these same solutions. So I think the first thing is just deeply understanding the outcomes and the all of the resources that students have. If the goal is to ensure a quality customer lifecycle of a prospective student through student to alumni, and hopefully that they repeat that process at the same institution, we need to understand all of the requirements of each of the different components and facets because, again, institutions are huge. They each have colleges, but then there's all of these subdivisions. I think the goal is also to understand what data do you have, or is there anything accessible to be able to tell that story. So part of the challenge thinking about that customer experience is that it's important to understand how someone is engaging with the institution and the resources that they have, to also understand things like retention or lack thereof, or just quality experience, or even risk in some of the concerns that students face, transitioning into an institution. So the problem is that there's oftentimes not enough data in one compact area to even allow institutions to have a case study to really look at that life cycle of what the student experience might be. It's really kind of like a merging of a bunch of different data points that have to kind of be determined. You have to find a unique identifier because when the data is collected, there's never the thought, there's, I shouldn't say never, but there's not necessarily a thought of how do we ensure that we're centralizing this at some point in the future. It's kind of collected in a silo. So I think one solution is also ensuring that there is data governance, right? That data dictionary is created, and so that it's just very clear, even if the work is siloed, what each data point means, right? So attendance at the registrar level is typically different from the attendance requirement at a student services level, assuming that one is curricular and one is co-curricular, right? In terms of being able to maintain enrollment in school, typically the curricular takes the cake. Co-curricular is typically not a requirement in the same way, right? But it doesn't mean that it's not important and may have some requirements to that curricular perspective. And so the issue is that when those are disjointed, it again takes away the two critical components that impact the students, the customer experience, and it's very difficult in most institutions to merge those two. And so it starts again with like the data warehouse, how that's built, the data governance structure. And so I think the solution would be to kind of start there, understand how the systems exist, understand the requirements and the needs of each, of the kind of major players, and then ensure that there's a comprehensive understanding of the data point. So another example is legal name, right? Legal name is kind of what is kind of legally filed with in terms of tax purposes, or, kind of what does your ID legally say, versus preferred name, right? Which is also another significant data point, right? It is possible that a student may so choose to be called by their preferred name, even though they have not legally changed their legal name for a myriad of reasons, right? So even something like that is understanding, okay, while legal name is critically important for all intents and purposes, whether it be marketing and communication or just general communication with professors or co-curricular parties, that student should be addressed by the preferred name. Getting that incorrect could also create a series of different challenges. So it really does also go back to not only that governance, but also defining what each field means, and then having a mechanism to ensure that the data can be structured in a way to accommodate those sort of nuances.
Absolutely, absolutely. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think if I were to summarize it in a couple of words, and I think there's so many more discussions to have on this matter. One is, thinking from the end. When looking at whether it's higher education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's a public sector institution, looking from the end of the entire experience and all of the interactions with that individual, that customer, that, constituent, however you want to put it, and understanding all of the different ways that the institution interacts with that individual, and understanding, at the end of the day, what can we carve out as being, like, let's call this sacred truth about that person. And then there are additional circles of data around that student, and building off and continuing to build off. And there might be different life cycles based on the different types of data. But if one takes like a broader, higher level architecture, enterprise architecture view of this, you have an opportunity to start moving in that direction. Now, the problem is that we really need to acknowledge here is that no one is going into a situation, unless it's a brand new higher education institution where they're starting from scratch. You have 30, 40 years of legacy systems and hundreds of systems across all these institutions. So this is not a small effort. But I think that some of these guiding principle type ideas are what are important to start creating across all the institutions, so everyone can begin to understand what the overall flow is of student data, and then how the different institutions can start to connect the dots. Now, we have a lot more to talk about on this topic for sure, but thank you everyone for joining, and we look forward to sharing with you more about this in future episodes.